right, well, this is our third week on the parable of the prodigal sons, plural, right? I think we've got that down now, and so far we have spent 1 week each on those two sons, the younger son, and then last week we looked at the older son, and we learned that they really aren't that much different from each other. Both were really more interested in what the Father could give, what God can give, than in the Father himself. They just had different ways of going about getting what they wanted. The younger son, he did that by rejecting all the cultural norms and just basically taking what he wanted. The older son, his path was to follow all of the cultural norms very strictly with the expectation that he would be rewarded for having done so. And so the idea that we looked at last week, that of doing what is right, really because what we're wanting is the blessings of the Father rather than doing those things out of a love for God like the older son did, that is a challenging word for us to hear, to think, man, is actually a part of me, that I do what I do really to get God's blessings, and to really seek to repent of the reason why we do good things. That is some real soul searching that one has to do. Now the younger son, he had a real change of heart. But with the older son, if you remember, we didn't read that parable today, but remember, Jesus really left that with a cliffhanger. I mean, he's standing outside of the party with his arms folded. He's angry. He hasn't repented yet. And he's really more concerned with what he was going to get or not get than the joy of his Father. And again, that's a tough thing for church people to hear because a lot of times church people identify more with being an older brother. But we also then considered how we might be an older brother or sister if we have hidden sin, if we have pride, if we get angry with God, if we question God's grace, or if we are, as mentioned here, more interested in what God can give than in God himself. And again, challenging stuff there, but in our discussion time after the worship last week, we were again discussing how both brothers they were wrong, and somebody asked the question, is there then a third brother that it really sets the example for us to follow? Dave gets a star for asking that question there. And so we're getting to that this morning because there is a third brother in this story, and that kind of is where we get to at the end. Now you might know that the parable of the prodigal son was preceded by the two scriptures or two parables that you heard just a minute ago. The parable of the lost coin and of the lost sheep. And what is different about those two parables compared to the prodigal son is that someone goes looking for what was lost. The widow, she lights a lamp and she goes looking for the lost coin. The shepherd, he leaves, kind of makes that irrational decision, of leaving the 99 sheep to go find the one lost lamb. So it seems a little crazy there, but there's a sense of urgency that you see in both of the widow and the shepherd, to go find what is lost. And that is really a critical theme in the whole New Testament, is finding those who are lost. And Jesus more than once said that he came to seek and to save those who were lost. But in the parable of the prodigal son, no one goes looking for the younger son. And I've always found that kind of odd, curious, interesting. And so my take on that has always been that God is just willing to let people go down their path and hit rock bottom. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago, because really when you hit the bottom, that tends to wake people up. We saw that with the younger son. That's when he came to his senses finally and turned around and went home. And we've probably watched that happen in other people's lives. They got to hit the bottom before they're going to turn around. And so there is a truth, I think, in viewing it that way. But remember, I mentioned this last week, but I'm leaning for this series on a book by Timothy Keller titled Prodigal God. Now, actually, that title might sound a little odd to you. Why is it called Prodigal God? We'll get to that next week. All right, so this is, I've probably got 2, maybe even yet 3 more weeks yet in this series. But in this book, it's a great little book, he sheds light on my question of why no one goes looking for the younger son. So we'll get to the answer here shortly. But in that culture, we need to understand that if there was a wayward son, and these things happened, it was, happened back then too. So if there was a younger son, there was an expectation that the older brother, if there was an older brother, if not an older brother, at least one of the siblings, it was expected that they go and look for and bring their younger son home. And again, now if there was an older brother, it really fell to him. That was his responsibility to go find the lost son and bring him home, really for the sake of the father. I mean, this is for the sake of the joy and the peace of the father and of the whole family. And that law or expectation was rooted in the story of Cain and Abel. And so you know what happened there. So, when Abel went missing, God approaches Cain and he asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" And do you remember what Cain's response was to God? Am I my brother's keeper? And so out of that text, I mean, the rabbis, they interpreted the scriptures, in so many ways. So for ages and ages, generations, hundreds of years, the rabbis out of that scripture said the answer to that question is yes. Yes, you are your brother's keeper. And so even in a case where, you've got the wayward brother, so because you are your brother's keeper, yes, you have to go and look for your younger brother and bring him home. And so, and going and looking for your lost brother might come at a cost for you. So if there was any expense, that's coming out of your pocket. The older son, he is paying for all of his travel expenses or whatever it takes to bring the younger son home. And that was part of respecting your elders, which was like one of the number 1 rules in that culture. And so Jesus' target audience was not the sinners and tax collectors with this parable. His real target was the Pharisees and the religious folks, because they really were the older brothers in the story. And they weren't concerned about their younger brothers. They weren't concerned about, all those lost souls out there, the tax collectors and sinners and so forth. They were just filled with pride, and they weren't going and looking for them. So Jesus was really very intentional about not having someone go looking for the younger son. Because he's saying, listen, you older brother types, you need to lay down your pride and then go and look for your lost brothers and sisters out of a love for God and out of a love for them. And the Pharisees didn't like it. The Pharisees did not like that they were being told that. They also did not like the fact that older son, at the end of the story, where it was kind of a cliffhanger there, that older son, he's outside the party. And that's a representation of heaven. And Jesus is very clear about this. And there's no second guessing what Jesus was meaning here. So, again, they did not like that message. And I think Jesus' message to the Pharisees, it carries down today. It carries down to the church today with this question: what kind of older brothers and sisters are we? And think about it. I mean, I think churches today are largely, not totally, but largely represented by older brother type people. Now, hopefully, that crowd in general is not prideful, as prideful at least as that older brother that we see in the parable. But at the very least, I think church people tend to be people who have worked hard. They have followed the expectations of the culture and of the church. And there used to be a day when those two things were very much, hand in hand, and not so much anymore. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of church people are people who have taken care of their families. They've saved their money. They have spent it wisely. They didn't waste water when they were growing up. If you remember that story that I shared from last week about my brother, comparing myself to my brother. And I'm remembering one story that I meant to share last week, so now I get to tell you now. But in comparing myself, the older brother, to my younger brother, when I was a kid, I took care of my toys. My brother, he destroyed his toys. My mom has bags of toys from when I was a kid. I think she might have one or two things left over from Rick's stuff. And so when his kids were at our parents', they were playing with my toys from when I was a kid, and I being there at Christmas time, and I'm just kind of watching, making sure don't tear them up, like your dad did, So, anyway, there's just that big difference. So, a lot of church people, we took care of our toys. I mean, we're just those kind of people. We're rule followers, and so. There's this difference between older sons and younger sons, and so there can be then that separation between church folks and whom we might call younger brother, younger sister type people, and then it leaves those type of people feeling like they're not welcome in church, and that feeling may be real. It may be perceived, but either way, it's a problem for the church, and it's something to overcome, and perception is reality, and I would like to think it's more perception than reality, but either way, it is a challenge for the church, and it reminds us, again, what kind of older brothers and sisters are we? Are we the type of people who are really going to go out and seek them, or not? And I think a lot of times, when we're not, I mean, maybe when we're not seeking the lost or those younger brothers and sisters, maybe part of it is that we don't like being around those different types of people. Maybe a part of it really is, though, about the fact that we're just kind of uncomfortable and we don't know how to relate to younger brother type people. I hope it's more of the latter than the former. But again, we need to make that effort to go out and get to know other types of people and befriend them. That's a whole other sermon. I won't get into that here today because that's, for one, I don't have time. Two, that's more of next week's message. But we see that this parable, for all of its talk about money and inheritances, it's really more about our need to love God, to love the Father, and to share His heart for those who are lost. And to just have that sense of urgency to go out there and to bring the lost home for the joy of the Father, because that's what matters most. And this is what Jesus did. Jesus went to the tax collectors and to the sinners, and those people, they flocked to Jesus. And so, to come full circle and answer Dave's question, who is the older brother? Who is that third brother in the story? It's Jesus. Jesus is the true older brother or third brother in that story. And think about it. Jesus left home. He left heaven to seek and to save those who are lost. Older brothers and younger brothers alike. And it came at great cost to him. And we need to realize that the older brother, he paid a steep price for that younger son coming home. And it wasn't just the fattened calf that was served at that party. We talked about that last week, that, man, that's expensive stuff. That's kind of like inviting the whole town to City Square Steakhouse. You know, that's an expensive bill. But the expense to the older son, it went beyond that. Because remember, the father did not make the younger son earn his way back into the family. He bestowed sonship upon him right there with grace. And as a son, as a member of the family, he's an heir to the estate. Okay? And we know that he already blew a third of it. Now the older son, the firstborn, one of the laws of that land of that day was that the older son got a double portion of the inheritance. I remember hearing that as a kid, and I thought, that sounds pretty good. It's probably how I became a rule follower. But anyway, but now this younger son, he's back. And he's an heir to a third of the remaining 2/3. And don't underestimate the fact that the older son is putting that together. Oh, he is not happy about the cost. And really, it's not about a prescription on how to do an inheritance. It's what Jesus wants on people's minds is the fact that there's an incredible amount of cost that goes into extending grace. I mean, the older son, he paid a price. And Jesus as our older brother in the story, Jesus paid an incredible price. He died on the cross for us. And not only that, he took upon himself the sins of the whole world, of all people, of all time. He bore the punishment for that in that moment on the cross. And he was cut off from God as well in that moment. And that separation, I mean, he faced separation from God in his death. Now, of course, he rose from the dead. Of course, he ascended into heaven, and he's seated at the right hand of God. But still, going through that was an incredible price that he paid. But he paid that in order to bring you and me home. And we are celebrating that this morning in communion. And we've got, like I said, we've got at least a couple more weeks in this series. And so we'll look more at our need to be the type of people to take that grace and extend it out to others. But for now, we are going to move into communion